I'm Ellen Colodney. I have Wetland Plants Incorporated in Edenton. We grow wetland plants for shoreline erosion control and a lot of stormwater management. But we've worked on a number of projects with the Coastal Federation and with some private landowners. So we're very interested in this application of plants, and it's an incredible tool. The influx of biological activity as soon as you install the plants in these shorelines is just amazing. Okay, and I'm supposed to do this button. There we go. So why do we bother with plants? Well, there's several major reasons. We want that erosion control, the dissipation by the stems, the capturing by the soils.
Can you step to the right or the left? Oh, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
No, you're right.
There we go. I'm going to do this. So I have it. There we go. Is that better?
Yep.
Everybody can see? Okay. So we also, in our work in stormwater particularly, we want pollution removal. That's another mechanism which plants are really, really good at. They're good at settling the sediments, which carry a lot of the phosphorus in particular, and other pollutants. We want the nutrient uptake, although that's generally speaking a pretty minimal effective pollutant removal mechanism for plants. We want the aerobic anaerobic interface, the oxygenated zone and the no oxygen zone of the saturated soil, and that supports a tremendous biological community, bacterial community for the most part, that does a tremendous job of breaking down nutrients and denitrification. We also want these plants because they are the basis of the food pyramid. So the plants capture the sunlight, they're broken down by the little microbes and fed on by little benthic invertebrates, and that it supports the entire food web in the estuarine system. There's a lot of plants that you could choose from. We have about 375,000 candidates. But of those, we want things that are going to be fast growing, year-round tops, deep running roots, tolerant of wet soil, tolerant of wave energy, tolerant of a wide range of soils, because we're going to be planting them into different substrates, and capable of being commercially produced, which is a limiting factor. We only want locally native plants, and that seems like a no-brainer for those of us who have worked in invasive species, but it's not. And in California, Spartina alterniflora, which is one of our cornerstone tidal marsh species here, was by, unfortunately, somebody in my field, moved to California since there were no commercially available local Spartinas in California. And that has been now the focus of a major eradication effort because of that moving with it from one coast to the other. And Phragmites, for instance, is a native species in the US, in North Carolina, but the one that you see that's invasive, same species, but a European origin, genetic origin. So for that reason, we really want to only use species that are locally native within the physiographic region, so coastal plain in this case, and state. So basing that down and narrowing it down, we have 10 core species. They're all grass-like species. And the final cut that you determine, that determines what you want for your site, is salinity and water level. And I'm particularly interested in, it's very well established what goes where in the salt areas and the highly brackish areas, but around this area, you're going to be doing a lot more work in low salinity and freshwater systems. So matching your species to the long-term salinity is absolutely critical, and there's great variation. This is a, I think actually this might be a NOAA map saying what salinity is where. And when you break it down in terms of what the plants need, you're going to have your brackish to seawater, so anything over 5 parts per thousand, there, is going to basically require a highly salt-tolerant plant. So anything from just brackish enough where you know it's brackish to full seawater is the same fundamental group of plants. Then slightly brackish is a little tricky. It's the ones that are less than 5, and then freshwater is a different group. The plants that we use for salt areas are the Spartina alterniflora, the Spartina patens, or Disticus spicata. So the smooth cordgrass, the salt meadow cordgrass. What's that? Oh, he's just talking. Saltgrass and Panicum amerum for the higher parts of the system. This, okay, yeah, there we go. Where in a salt system, it's all based on tides. So we have the mid-tide to the mean high tide, the mean high tide to spring tide, and above spring tide. And for us who are like plant people and don't know about tides, spring tide is that extra high tide that you get not in spring, but because of some rebound effect of the oceans based on the lunar position or something. But it's an extra high tide. So there's a zone for brackish to seawater areas that's from mid-tide, so halfway between mid and high, and up to the mean high tide. And figuring out where these things are, for me, I look at the surrounding vegetation. That's going to tell me exactly what goes where. If I can get a reference level and I see what's growing at that reference level nearby, I know what it is. Otherwise, you might have to get help, which is not going to be me. It's going to be your CAMA guy or your surveyor. From mean high tide to spring tide is the Spartina patens and Disticus, which is saltgrass. And I have some plants here if you want to take a look. This is just, they all go dormant this time of year, so they don't really look like very much, but they still have their tops. Above spring tide, Panicum amerum, which is bitter panicum or beach panic grass. It's a plant that if you're going in areas with a lot of sand, it takes no nutrients and it grows very well in sterile sands. Slightly brackish, and this is all in that handout, by the way, so don't worry about this if you don't remember anything. The mid-tide to mean high tide, or areas normally flooded by a few inches of water, is still that Spartina alterniflora, which is the bright green. Mean high tide is spring tide, or where the soil is saturated and not normally flooded. You get Juncus romerianus, which is this gray stuff that you see when you're driving over the bridge, and Spartina cyanosauroides, which is big cordgrass. So they're really specific in elevation and salinity. And there's not a lot of choice when you're doing these because there's just a limited number of plants that can handle all these conditions, and particularly the salt. Above the mean high tide, where the soil is wet to moist but not normally flooded, you can get the Spartina patens, which is that one, when it's not dormant, the one that's going around, and Cladium, which is sawgrass, typical of the Everglades, but occurs a lot around here. Then when we're moving into things that are much less brackish, very slightly brackish, there's actually things that are you can use in shade this shoreline sedge, which is something that you'll see in the Albemarle region like this. It's Carex hyalonolepis. It grows in shade. It's a sedge as opposed to a true grass. And if you're in the sterile sands, you would use that Panicum amerum or the bitter panicum because it takes no nutrients. And if you're in a richer soil, you would use Panicum virgatum, which is switchgrass. Freshwater, we end up actually having more of a challenge or more of a limitation in what will grow. So what we have found hands down that survives freshwater shoreline erosion control, living shoreline conditions very well, even very high energy sites, is a plant called Zizaniopsis miliacea, which is called giant rice cutgrass or water millet. And that's the one that can actually handle water. When you're figuring out what water you're going to use as your level to plant relative to, wind tides become absolutely critically important. So in the Albemarle Sound region, the difference of the water level in the winter versus summer can vary by 2 feet. And what we're looking for is the highest sustained water level that occurs throughout the year. And by sustained, we're looking for 72 hours. So that can be really hard to tell. Sometimes you can find a reference site. Sometimes you got to talk to somebody and say, you know, how high does it get here in the winter or in a spring storm or something where the wind will blow it up for prolonged days. So plants can basically hold their breath for about 72 hours, and after that they drown. So you got to plant relative to that high water level. And if you are planting one of these areas, you may be planting in what looks like just a barren, dry sand 2 feet away, you know, vertically above the water, and that's what you got to do. So when in doubt, you want to plant high. Plants can always take being planted higher than they're growing in the wild, and they will walk themselves down to the deepest level that they can tolerate. If you try to plant them too low, you guess too low, they can't survive that. So going back to which species, the moist to flooded by a few inches of water for 3 or more days at a time is this Zizaniopsis miliacea. And this is that species there. This is the Eden House project on the Chowan River. And that Zizaniopsis is growing currently in up to 1 foot of water. But when we planted it, we only planted it into about 3 inches of water and then let it work its way out. And it did very, very well there. In this site too, we used bitter panicum, Panicum amerum, as the inland onshore plant. We wanted to do additional stabilization there, and that did well because this area was filled with a sterile sand, very low nutrient. Even though it's a freshwater system, the fill was a very low nutrient sand, so switchgrass did not do well, but Panicum amerum did, the bitter panicum did. And the shrubs, we tried a whole bunch of different shrubs, and the ones that grew, which you see in here, is all wax myrtle, which is a facultative nitrogen fixer. So for a shrub, we did that. Again, if you're in shade, the Carex hyalonolepis, the shoreline sedge, is going to be the only plant that we know of that you can reliably plant in 3 inches or so of water in a living shoreline, and it will provide stabilization in shade. Freshwater areas, you're going to go, if you're in the like I said, in the fill areas. If it's sterile sand, you're going to do the Panicum amerum. In the richer soils, the Panicum virgatum. So preparing to plant, there's a number of things you have to think about. You got to buy the plants. You want things that are grown from local wild seed. Seeding itself doesn't work because the seeds, all these plants have a pretty complex dormancy requirements that need to be broken. And you can do that, but by the time that happens after planting, the seed's probably going to be germinating for somebody's shoreline a couple miles away. So it really doesn't help you. Everything needs to be grown in containers. And we prefer the size that's coming around, which is a deep but narrow container. And we like that because it gets the roots down into the soil to the moisture level. It keeps the plant in place. It's kind of like sticking rebar in a little bit more than a typical shallow and wide root ball. And it seems to support a more vigorous plant. You want to install the plants in the season of rapid growth. Am I doing it again? Okay. Was I walking in front of it again? Which for these plants, they're all warm season plants. They want to grow in spring to summer. That's their season of rapid expansion. They can be and have been successfully planted at other times of year, but usually in low energy sites. And so spring and summer, if you can do it then, and spring being after the first spring frost, summer being roughly June, it seems to give them the best chance of establishing. And we also are trying to get it done so that they have about 6 weeks to get the roots established before the first hurricane is likely to hit. Hurricanes being an issue. Typical spacing may be 12 to 18 inches. As Aaron, I think, was saying, that this U.S. Army Corps of Engineers publications were saying 2 feet apart. And that doesn't give any immediate wave dissipation. The tighter spacing, the 6 inches it can be kind of expensive, but if you're dealing with a high energy site and you want to really cluster the plants so that they can break the wave energy for their neighbors, that can be helpful. So if you're dealing with small root ball plants, so smaller plants, which a lot of the ones sold are pretty small, they're smaller than this. Higher energy sites, if you're planting late in the season or if you have unlimited funds, you may want to go tighter spacing. If you're in a low energy site, you can go looser spacing. So it's very dependent upon your site conditions. If you don't have enough plants, you want to cluster the plants together, hopefully in a lower energy site, little microsite first. So taking your plants and tucking them right behind the sill, it's a little sheltered spot or next to some existing vegetation, something that can break the wave energy for them will help them. If you can't cover the whole site, those are the spots you want to go first. So you want to budget for supplemental plantings. And even if you have your site completely well covered and planted, storms happen and they can wipe out a site if the plants haven't gotten established. And it does take, in my mind, about 6 weeks to get establishment. Shorter for some species, that's Zaniopsis. I think it's probably 2 that the stuff really grows, but they need time to root in, keep themselves in place. And designs need to be tweaked. So it may be that you got the fill levels a little bit too low, or there's a little bit, the offshore sill needs to be added to a little bit. Things like that happen. So I think for a routine planting site, which is not under undue stress. You should still budget. If I'm a contractor, I would want to budget for like 50% supplemental planting. And if I'm in a really, really, really high risk site, risk factors like planting late, you might have to go to 3. If you're not sure of your design, you just, as a contractor, you need to really cover yourselves for that. I don't think you've ever really, well, Eden House took us a couple tries before we got established. There's different sites vary, but you've had some that, like that Scirpus robustus site, where
There was a zone at the Jockey's Ridge site that didn't establish.
yeah, and then we had to go pick a new species that fit that site. Fertilizer, to me, fertilizer is like a really cheap insurance. You don't, in my mind, broadcast fertilizer over your site. I use slow release fertilizer tablets, 2-year tablets, like 21 grams that you can put right in the planting hole. And particularly if you're in fill, that's a low nutrient fill, which a lot of fills are. There's some studies early on that showed that was beneficial. I think it really depends on what your substrate is. If you have a well-established, gentle shoreline that you're not having to fill, you may be just fine without doing fertilizer. I don't think that the Coastal Federation routinely uses fertilizer, but to me, it's something that I would do. You got to figure out where your key water zones are. So knowing where your spring tide, your mean high tide, your mid tide are, absolutely critical. Like I said, I use the reference vegetation. And wind tide's the highest sustained water level in a year. That rack line that you see there, that's your mean high tide, sort of. But now I just learned that can be 10 inches of variation seasonally in a lunar tide. I never knew that. But the plants will definitely know. That's the cool thing about knowing your reference plants, because they know exactly what the conditions are over a long period. If you have thick organic debris on your site, you must clean it off. Plants can't be planted in thick organic debris and survive. They will die. And if you clear it off one day and come back the next day, this has happened to me, and it has another foot of thick organic debris, you got to change your plan. Dry spots, like I said, the plant roots must be in contact with moisture when they go in. So if you're planting in coir logs, those logs have to be moist. If you're above the spring tide, or if you're in a wind tide area where you're having to plant in the warm season and you're 2 feet above where there currently is water, then you should use a soil moist type product, which I think I may have a picture. Okay. I don't have a picture of it, but soil moist is a hydrogel that you mix with water and put in the hole with the plant. And then if I'm planting in really dry areas where I have to use soil moist, I usually irrigate using whatever water is out there right next to my site. Irrigating a dry area after installation is really, really helpful for developing a capillary bond between the soil particles and the plant roots. And that allows the water to be transferred to the plant. Anything that works to dig a hole is good. It depends entirely on your substrate. If you're working in sand, I think the dibble bar works really, really well. That's that red thing. If you have a strong guy, you can use a soil auger, or if you're working in tougher augers, it's a bulb auger on a drill, which could be a gas-powered drill, or a spade, anything that you can get a plant hole that's about 2 inches deeper than your root ball of your plant, and you drop in your fertilizer, your slurry of soil moist if you have to use it, and press the hole closed. And you want about 2 inches or so of your soil over the root ball as maximum. So you don't want the top of the root ball to be exposed to the air because it has a higher evaporative rate than most surrounding soils. So you don't want that root ball exposed. You want the surrounding soil to be covering it, but up to 2 inches. And these plants are adapted to getting stuff thrown on top of them, so they do fine with that. That's what I said, irrigating your dry spots. So any questions? That was pretty fast, and I'm sorry for all the Latin. Okay, we got to wait for. And disagreements. If anybody has experience that's different, I want to hear about it, definitely, so we can all learn.
I got a couple questions, and this may sound interesting. We love grass.
I'm sorry?
We love grass, and that we see that that's what we need to work towards, but working on so many areas in the Outer Banks, how about trees? We lose a lot of trees, and we need trees back. We losing them all the time. And once the grass is established, I can see the trees coming behind. That's one question.
So I think your question is why don't we use more woody plants, trees or shrubs?
I guess so. It's just the basis on all the conversation now and in another is mostly about grass. And
yes,
it's the first part of the sequence, but we should also be looking about bringing trees. The root mass after the shores are better established and all that, bringing back the trees that are, the kind of trees that we need on the shorelines.
Well, I think the question is a really good one, and there's a couple reasons, things to consider. The first is that grasses with their multiple stems and extensive fine root structures are more capable of stabilizing high energy areas and precipitating sediment than woody plants are, which tend to have much less fibrous root systems. The other thing is if the woody plants tend to grow at higher elevations than these herbaceous plants, there's not many that will grow. When you're talking a salt marsh, you're up pretty high, but there are certainly baccharis that would grow in that area. But if our primary goal is erosion management, the tops of the grasses are going to do a better job than the woodies. And I'm a little concerned in Eden House, for instance, this project here. There has been some natural recruitment of bald cypress, which would be there. I mean, that would be the wooded forested edge that probably site was originally covered by. And there is some recruitment, but I know that if that is allowed by itself, it can shade out the marsh, and then we would go back to the type of erosion that's happening in the adjacent forested areas. And that is less able, from what I've seen, to handle sea level rise and the change in elevation, which has been quite prominent over the Albemarle. So those areas that are forested can have a pretty significant erosion rate compared to a marsh, in my opinion. Has anybody observed that or have an opinion on that? Nobody. So I guess I'm like the one who we have to listen to. But it's a really good question, and I think this site is a good one to watch and see what happens.
The other question very quickly, there's a concern about fertilizers and some of that debris that accumulates. Wouldn't it be good to try to burn it? Because in a way, when you burn, you will fertilize those soils down below. But there's concerns about burning some of that debris on the shore. So I don't know.
I've not thought about that. I don't know that any of the systems that we are planting are fire dependent. And I've not heard of anyone doing that. It's an interesting point. Yes, Carolyn.
I don't know, I've just heard of this, but I have heard of people burning shorelines to maintain the Juncus Marsh.
Okay, oh, cool.
But for that reason, to maintain the grassy shoreline.
And how does that, what are they burning against? Woodies or woodies?
Yeah.
So
They're,
for Phragmites control.
they're also burning the duff off of the marsh platform and allowing some of the regeneration to occur a little bit easier. And then it releases some of the nutrients back into the soil.
Oh, cool.
And
They're just picking up the pace on what happens naturally through lightning.
exactly, yeah, marshes would have naturally burned very easily, at least
Yeah.
the surface from lightning.
Okay.
Right. Yeah,
Well, that's very interesting. So burning has some benefits. And
absolutely.
And typically a burned ecosystem, grassland system, you get more diversity for sure.
Right, and since the soil stays moist, the soil wouldn't burn, so you wouldn't
Right.
lose elevation so much.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yes, and the next question is fertilizers. Installing fertilizer in a system that's obviously a nutrient sensitive, harmed by excess nutrient system. And I think that's a really good point. It's the reason why I only would use a slow release fertilizer tablet. And those tablets, they're a slow release underwater as they are in a terrestrial system. And it's putting the nutrients where the plant can actually get it. So it's strictly a capture the site versus a way to speed up capture of the site. And we definitely have noticed slow vegetative growth in some sites that weren't fertilized or have particularly low nutrient fill. So, and nitrogen and phosphorus can be limiting factors. So to me, I don't worry very much about escape of that fertilizer into the surrounding environment because of the form. But that's subject to debate, I think. Anybody else? Yes.
I just wanted to speak to the tree question, which was a really good one.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why we move away from using trees is because of our low-lying elevation makes areas susceptible to storm surge. So if you get a major storm surge and you have that salt water sitting on top of a fresh marsh or a forested wetland, the salt is going to really stress those seedlings and saplings, and you might not have survival. So we've had an experience where we tried using trees, and Hurricane Irene put salt water on them for 2 weeks, and most of them died except for the bald cypress. So,
Right.
So, just in thinking about shorelines that may be exposed to any kind of salt storm surge, that's a big concern.
And that's one area where using a reference plant population can be a challenge, because the woody plants that you see there, such as the bald cypress, a lot of times bald cypress is one that as a youth, or Nyssa aquatica, say water tupelo, as a young tree, they're very much more susceptible to salt damage than a mature species, so or more mature specimen. So you may find one at an adjacent elevation, same elevation, that's doing well, but usually those are plants that are 100 years or so older. and they established when they had less of a salt influence. I'm surprised
As you
your
move
bald
down
cypress
to
lily-
Florida, subtropical areas and tropical areas, trees, manglers are way for shore protection. And is there anything similar to that? I mean, pushing the subject? No?
So the
No.
question is trees for shoreline.
Like
away-
in South Florida, you know, where you have
Yes.
islands that are protected by true roots.
Yes. In this area, in freshwater systems, the dominant shoreline erosion, the natural shoreline vegetation, this area being the Sound, is forested. And it's a bald cypress and Nyssa aquatica water tupelo dominated system. And those plants are very resistant to movement by hurricanes, et cetera. But the soil that they're on is easily eroded. So we don't, and it may be because they tend to be fringes and because there's a lot of undulation in the shoreline areas, they tend to erode behind them. But it's a very good point. So in an area that has mangroves, certainly that's the correct system. But we don't have anything that really is equivalent here that's doing a great job. And looking at like the north edge of the Albemarle Sound, that 0.8 meters per year, you can see it happening, and it's a forested system. But it just goes through and then it hits a bluff and it knocks out that bluff and keeps on going. It just doesn't seem to work real well. Other questions?
Ellen, I just wanted to come back to the fertilizer question because it is a really good question, and I've gone back and forth about with Lexi, some people in the central part of the state about adding fertilizer. So certainly Spartina Marsh, and I'm sure most of your marshes, even though we talk these are nutrient sensitive waters, most of our coastal is pretty low nutrient water, and these are really productive plants, and so you will always see a response, a positive response, if you add fertilizer. So then the question becomes, are you causing harm to the surrounding area? And I can tell you that we've done a lot of fertilizer experiments where we haven't even dropped it below. We've just broadcast fertilizer on a square meter of marsh. And we can come back 2 months later and a square meter of big, tall, green marsh, but it's surrounded by the other marsh. So I agree. I think if you put that fertilizer subsurface, if you use a slow release fertilizer, yes, none of us want to be polluting the environment. It's not what we want to do. But on the other hand, we want to give that young plant the best chance we can of getting root before the storm comes or whatever else happens. So my experience is that the fertilizer does not go very far, and that it does have a very positive effect on the plants.
So when you dropped your fertilizer down, you were on an existing patch of marsh, and then, so it was able to capture. It didn't have the fertilizer washing away in your situation with surface applied fertilizer.
That's not on the shoreline. When I do it on
Yeah.
the shoreline, I put it down the hole.
Okay.
That's right. I wouldn't broadcast it.
Yeah. Right. Good.
That's like an extreme case. And it still isn't going anywhere.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay.
Thank you so much, Ellen.
That's it.